we're going to turn things over to tonight's speaker, Eric Wood. Eric studies, among other things, how the way that we've shaped cities has shaped the flora and fauna inside those cities. And we think of cities as things that are constantly changing, but a lot of the decisions that we make in cities last a very long time. For instance, Broadway in New York City started out as an Indian trail that got used by the Dutch and then widened by the English and then widened a lot more and paved by the Americans. The Champs-Élysées in Paris started out as a path going through the center of a garden before it turned into this huge wide street that helps define the city. Here in Los Angeles, we've done a lot of things, both good and bad, that have defined our cities. And the way the city has been shaped has, as I said, and as Eric will talk about, has shaped where the wildlife is and what wildlife exists now in our cities. A brief bio about Eric. Eric is an associate professor at Cal State LA, and he's also a researcher at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County. He got his PhD in forest and wildlife ecology at the University of Wisconsin. And he and his team have been doing a lot of just fascinating work about some of the ways, as I said, good and bad, that humans and animals have intersected with each other over the decades. So let's turn it over to Eric Wood. Cool. So what's your slides? Hopefully that's going to work. Hey
everybody, it's great being back. I don't know where I should stand, right here. I say great being back because I think the last time I was up here was 3 years ago, talking about some of the research that we were doing. We all know the story. It feels like 10 years ago with COVID. I feel like the last probably 8 presentations I've given have been over Zoom. So it's fun to be in front of people. And I'm kind of happy not to wear my mask right now because I was mentioning to a couple folks before that at Cal State LA, they're still pretty conservative with wearing masks when we teach, and it's totally fine. I don't mind doing that at all, but I want to be able to just talk about this stuff and blare it out without having to worry about chewing on certain things. So, is it working, Alex? It's working here. Well, I'll just say a couple things before I get into the presentation. First off, it's great to see a bunch of familiar faces. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Eric Wood. I'm the principal investigator of the Lab of Avian Ecology and Conservation. And I've been in LA for about 8 years now. And so we've been building my lab and working on various projects. And there's really 2 themes that we do in my lab. One is centered squarely on urban ecosystems or urban ecology. And urban ecology, all it is studying, like the classic definition of ecology is just studying the interaction of plants and animals, microbes, living things with their environment and each other. So urban ecology is just that, but doing it within urban ecosystems. I would say right now that under the big umbrella of ecology, that urban ecology is probably one of the hottest subfields that people are studying all across the world. It doesn't matter if you're in Singapore, it doesn't matter if you're in Shanghai, it doesn't matter where you are. I just got back from Tokyo. There's a bunch of researchers doing really interesting things there. It's great. Here in LA, we're actually at the forefront of a lot of what people are studying. Some of that is because we've messed some things up that deserves to be studied, but other things that because there's a lot of great researchers and a lot of great resources and a lot of interest and energy in studying some of the things that I'm going to talk about today. So urban ecology is one branch. Then we do a lot of work in the natural areas. Can you hear me over there? Yeah. Okay. Hello. Okay. So if I was talking here a little bit better. Okay, so is that better? Okay, good. The other thing we do is just a lot of work in our natural areas around Southern California. So we have projects in the Puente Hills, projects in the Santa Monica Mountains, and we do basic ecology, like studying the impacts of invasive species on birds. It's always got birds in there. It's always applied. There's always some kind of conservation aspect of it. And that's the niche that my lab's really trying to fill here in Southern California. There's a number of other labs doing certain things, but that's really what we're focused on. And today, what I'm going to talk about is going back to the urban stuff. And so you can see the title right here. here. The lasting effect, I have to look back every once in a while because I can't remember every single word on my slides. So I apologize if I come in and out of the microphone. The lasting effect of redlining on birds and the people who experience them. And what I'm going to present today is a paper that's in review. It's a very long paper. I wrote this paper with a number of colleagues over work that we've been doing for years. It's over 100 pages long. It's basically a book. And so it's a monograph that's in review right now. I'm just going to give you the snippets today because it kind of goes on and on and on because there's a lot of historical stuff. There's a lot of stuff about just current biodiversity. And there's kind of a lot of like where we need to go in that paper. So I'm going to try to do my best to narrow this down. 75% of my talk today is going to be about what you see up here. The last 25% is going to be about other stuff that we're doing in the lab. And I'm so glad to see Sean back there because I'm going to highlight some of Sean's stuff today. So let me see if I can get this thing to work right here. Okay. So just to start, I imagine there's a range, and you guys have probably heard about redlining. Maybe you're really familiar with it. In the ecology world, the idea of studying the downstream impacts of what was going on in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, et cetera, really gained a ton of interest in 2020. And in 2020, there was a pretty famous project that was finished at the University of Richmond called Mapping Inequality, where students, researchers, et cetera, got these old maps and they hand digitized everything, all these different colors you see here. So people like me can just go and get those, overlay them with all of our biodiversity data and start uncovering patterns and start trying to understand some things like, are there correlations with our investment patterns from historic times to current times? And so it was really about 2020 when this all began. And there's been just a ton of work that's actually been done since then. I'm going to kind of talk about my own motivation for this. We've been working on this project for about 3 years as well. So what is redlining? And I just want to get into it a little bit. And you have to really go back to the Great Depression to start tracing some of the origins here. So we just had a massive decline in home ownership during the Great Depression. And this was a big deal for our political and financial leaders. Having a home, that's the American dream. You know, this was a big thing for everyone, and losing that and having that go out, that was a problem for our political, the political forces at that time. They were worried about communism. They were worried about a number of different things. They said, we can't have this. We have to change this. We have to try to stabilize some things. So in 1933, and what's really important, what I'm going to talk about over the next couple of slides, is that this is all done at the federal level. So this is like from the government, what I'm eventually going to get to. So the U.S. Federal Home Loan Bank and Board, you're never going to have to remember that again, initiated a program named the Home Owners Loan Corporation, or the HOLC. Now, the HOLC, it had a number of different things it was going to do. There's 3 I label right here that were quite important. It was intended to assist homeowners who were in default on their mortgages. That was one of the first things. It was to stabilize the mortgage lending system, which was totally in disarray following the Great Depression. And then it was to identify prime areas for real estate investments. That last point is what I'm going to talk about here. How did they do this? How did they identify these prime areas for real estate investment? And importantly, so this program started in the 30s. 239 cities across the country. That's where it was going on. LA was actually one of like the model cities for it. It was spearheaded in LA and a couple of the other big cities across the country. And it didn't end until the 60s formally, and until the 1960s. So this was going on for quite some time. You might say, what was going on? So let's just kind of take a look at this image right here, West LA. You guys are all familiar with some of the cities here that you're going to be able to see. And you're going to note these 4 colors, red, yellow, blue, and green across this map. What was going on, what the HLC was doing was they're hand drawing these security risk maps. That's what this is called right here. And the security risk map, it had 4 things or 4 classes they were coming up with. And these 4 classes was where they were going to say we should invest or where we should not invest, or at least recommending. I'll talk about a little bit about like whether this was intended just for secret use or not. But these 4 areas, the green areas, that was labeled best. And so that's where the investment was supposed to happen. Note Beverly Hills, some of these other places were, quote, green lined. The blue, that was still desirable. So still investing heavily in those places. Then you get to the other side of the coin towards the yellow and the red areas. The yellow was definitely declining. That was like, hey, I don't know if we want to invest our money there. I'm not sure if that's good. And then the red, which is where redlining comes from, those were labeled hazardous. And so those areas was basically just like, there's not going to be money flowing into these communities. So if you're making these decisions and you're starting to make these decisions, and this actually happens in terms of investment, and this happens over, say, a couple of decades, there's all sorts of things that go on. downstream in terms of other investment programs or non-investment programs that continue to keep happening. So these cycles that start coming off this, and you can kind of see them as like ripples in the river that keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger downstream. All right, so we have these 4 categories here, and you might say, well, how did they make these categories? And it's important just to lay it out right now that it was inherently racially biased how you did this. And so if you go into each of these locations, you could actually go in and look at handwritten notes that are called area descriptions and how they describe the certain areas. And often there's very vulgar terminology used to describe who was living there. It's often people of color or other classist designations, whether it was old, whether it was Catholic, Jewish. There was a bunch of different things that they were writing about in here in terms of, hey, this is an area that's off limits. And then it was the other side in terms of saying this area is affluent, it's a good place to invest, it's very white, whatever it might be. So this was, again, coming from the federal government, so a form of systemic racism that was going out in terms of planning and investment. And when thinking about this, I know I'm spending a lot of time on this slide, but this is an important slide to talk about just to make sure we're all on the same page here. So thinking about this, looking downstream, focusing on ahead, what people have been doing is noticing all sorts of problems with public health in these redlined areas, all sorts of problems with like where freeways were developed or some certain things. And so this is what Chris was talking about in terms of this program had a big deal in terms of how our city and 238 other cities across the country have been developed. Where did this come in for me, and where did I really start getting interested in this? So in 2021, there was a really influential paper published by Dexter Locke. He's a really cool urban ecologist doing some interesting things, and he's very interested in the urban forest. And so all this is looking at right here, and I don't think, do I have a pointer here? Okay, just note down here, here's our area or the security risk zones, A, B, C, D zones that I was just talking about. And this is just looking at tree canopy cover across major cities. And so LA, we're already up there on your top left, and you can see in the green, there's higher tree canopy cover in those areas of high investment and much lower in the redlined areas. And you can see that for other cities, it's pretty stark in some places like Philadelphia. Chicago starts getting much different as well. So it's not just a pattern here, but it's a pattern everywhere. The story I tell people often when I got interested in a lot of this stuff, I first moved to Pasadena when I moved to LA, and I was living here for 2 years before I moved down to Monterey Park, where my wife and I now live and our family. And I'd always drive through San Marino, South Pass, and then get down to El Sereno, to where Cal State LA is, and you could just see it. You can just see it right there. And that's not the new to people who grew up in LA. You can see that when you're driving around town. But for me, that was kind of big news. I came from Ithaca before this. When I was at Cornell, it's a very different type of thing. And so I was just like, we got to study this. So this is really where we said, look, we've got a lot of experience studying the urban forest and inequality in the urban forest and how it affects birds, but we haven't looked at it historically. And so that's what I wanted to do. So we just wanted to kind of start taking our data and applying it towards this question and start looking at wildlife. I have some insect data, but we're basically just going to focus on birds. That's all I say wildlife here. And then other forms of habitat, we're just really interested in what's going on here. And like I said, we have experience with this in my lab, and I've shared some of this before. This is some of our street tree work, where when you go from low income to high income communities, you see a big time difference in the density of street trees all throughout the city. Street trees are public resources. They're used with public money. They're planted along the street, municipalities' rights of way, and people plant them all over, but it's whether they're going to stay alive and whether they're going to stay in certain areas. You go to high income areas, that's where you're going to find them. And that, of course, that carries over to influence birds, like migratory birds. You're going to find a much higher density of them, where you're going to find a much higher density trees. Not surprising, but still interesting when you start seeing these patterns. So anyway, we wanted to start looking at this redlining question historically and start saying, are there some indirect effects or correlations that we can see from that program to our data here? So that brings me to the research objectives, the 5 things that I'm going to share with you today. I'm going to talk first about patterns of our urban habitat and birds. We show lots of maps today for some of our stuff. I'm going to look at the drivers of bird abundance. It's basically just correlations of urban habitat and bird abundance throughout LA. I'm going to show some maps of the habitat features and bird distributions throughout the city. I'm going to show some other predictions that we have for birds and red lines. And then I'm going to try to tie this all together. We'll start looking at race ethnicity patterns in the city, and effectively who's experiencing or who may be able to experience urban avifauna throughout LA. All right, so how do we do something like this? We were pretty lucky in the lab because we've been surveying birds during the winter in Los Angeles for 8 years, ever since I've been here. If you go out to these black dots, these are survey locations where we'll go and do some censuses for different, just whatever the bird community is. We didn't set out to start studying this redlining stuff, but we just had the data to do it. And so we were actually kind of quite lucky because there's not many other research labs that have this. So you can see these black locations. This is where we were doing our surveys at those little dots. You can see some of the HOLC categories, the polygons on here, the colored ones. And if you just overlay our data or, whatever way, just saying, well, where do all of our survey locations happen? We have 12 that are in those A or B locations. Those are high investment. 13, which are in those C or D or low investment. And then we have 14 locations that were not at all part of the program. So they were not graded. And we use those as kind of a compare and contrast with some of these other sites. So we're lucky. We had data and we could start doing this. And that's one of the reasons why if anyone's doing this in the future or doing some research, it is important to monitor. It is important to go out and start doing things like surveying birds every year, because it's great to know that like the yellow-rumped warbler population is doing good this year and they weren't doing good last year, little things like that. But it's also good because you can apply it towards research questions like this. Okay, so if you go to every single one of those black dots, we have kind of a lot of sampling that we do. And so within each of those areas, there's 4 locations where we'll go and survey birds. So that's, I don't want to press the wrong button. Okay, so our 4 locations here. And at 4, so there's 39 locations throughout the city times 4, that's 156 locations where we do our surveys during the winter time. We count all birds in those locations. There's called point counts. You just go inside this side of the city street. These are only in residential areas. I shouldn't make that point. It's not downtown LA. It's not some like industrial zones. It's just residential areas throughout the city. So we'd count all birds, and we have data here for 3 winter seasons. And I'm not going to talk about why here. There's a bunch of validation and prediction stuff we had to do for the paper, but basically 3 seasons of data. Once you go out and you count all these birds, you can start grouping bird species and doing some stuff in the lab, like saying, hey, we have some hypotheses that birds that are affiliated with trees, like forest birds, we expect those to be more common in those A locations or those B locations based on some of those figures that I was showing earlier. So that's what we did. We basically aggregated all of our data into birds that we called forest birds or urban birds. Urban birds, there's about 15 species. Think of house finch, mourning dove, feral pigeon, the stuff that you would expect to see like in downtown LA, potentially. Those forest birds, think of some of our warblers, black-throated gray, Townsend warbler, yellow-rumped warbler, the stuff that you would need some tree canopy cover to more or less go out and find. And then we did a bunch of quantification of the habitat using remote sensing. We have a really interesting data set for this project too, where at every single parcel, we have information. And so there's millions of them, of course, in our database. We have information about every parcel, how much it costs, the square footage of all the parcels, all these kind of interesting things about the tree canopy or the impervious surface. And so a lot of that data is part of our analysis as well. Okay, so I just want to get into it and start talking about some of the patterns between habitat and birds. And so if we're looking in these locations, which are high investment, A, B, low investment, C, D, or the not graded. And we're just looking at land value, of course. And so keep in mind, this is current land values, but this is based on this historic process. You can see the land value is much higher in those areas that were in some of the AB locations. The square footage of houses is much bigger, noteworthy, and notably, look at this, in those areas where they were, quote, redlined, much smaller houses, probably much denser in terms of packed together. The tree canopy is much higher and those areas that were in the green lines or blue, and no difference between the redlining and the not graded. And then the impervious surface cover was much higher. So just think of like paved areas in these red line zones. And so you can think, okay, this is kind of like taking this historic look and looking at like the development of the city. And you'd think, well, some of these things can't we kind of correct, like planting more trees or some of this stuff over time? And you think, of course you can, but like this thing still persists right now when you're looking at some of these patterns. So there's definitely patterns going on here. And you might say, well, how does it look for the birds in terms of what the birds are going to be doing? If you just look at our forest bird group, they were much more abundant in areas that were in either the A or the B, high investment areas, and less so in those red line zones. Keep looking at this though. Keep looking at how these are similar. And so what I want to point out here, and I didn't say this earlier kind of on purpose because I want to show this right now, these were all kind of low income communities throughout LA. So they weren't part of the process, but potentially there's still some other things going on in terms of maybe current investment current tree canopy cover, whatever it is, that's still influencing birds. So it's not just saying this is the only thing, the redlining stuff. This is getting just generally at whether it's historic or more contemporary forms of income inequality and how that carries over to affect our biodiversity that you're still starting to see here. But I'm going to get into why the redlining is worse a little bit later. Okay, and then when we look at our urban bird abundance, much more abundant in terms of those urban birds up here in these the C and D locations, the red line zones. What I'm going to come back to later, and I guess I'm going to plant this seed right now for you guys to think about in this presentation, is I'm going to talk a little bit about public health. And I'm going to talk a little bit about whether it matters, whether you have a yellow-rumped warbler in your yard or a house finch. We talk often about how birds bring joy to people, whether you can hear a song, whether you look at it, we all know that, you know, here being a part of an Audubon group. But when we're writing this paper, we thought an awful lot about this because we tried to say, what could be, is it bad if you're experiencing one of these or the other? What's the difference here? And I'm going to talk a little bit more later about what we kind of came to a conclusion about. But I want to plant that seed now for you to be thinking about in terms of what it means to experience both of these, because you're going to see that when we get to the race and ethnicity stuff. Okay, so what drives bird abundance around LA? And unsurprisingly and frustratingly from a conservation biologist position, it's money. That's what it is. And it's not only LA where you see this in a lot of different places. So if you look at just land value and the prediction for forest bird abundance, there's a strong positive relationship. To get a relationship like this in ecology is very difficult. And so this means that like this is really what's explaining a lot of the differences and where you're actually finding these birds. And you see that opposite pattern for where those urban birds are occurring. And again, that's a pretty strong thing. Note here that you look at these colored dots, those line up with the areas that are high investment, the blue, low investment, the red. You see some places like this down here. Does anyone have any, yeah, this is kind of crazy because you know, we were saying, these are Whittier. This is Whittier right down here. And in terms of some of these areas, does anyone have a guess about an area that was redlined back in the day that's actually doing quite well for supporting birds? The only reason why I'm asking this is because Pasadena. And so that's right. And so it's Northwest Pasadena. And so we're going to get to this later too about what you can possibly do and if you're doomed if something like this happened. Okay, so whoops. So tree canopy cover, which is just something you would expect is going to be a strong driver. It's not as strong in terms of the land value. So when you're getting at this, it's like, of course, it's not money that birds are falling around, but it's everything else that's affiliated with it, whether it's a large yard size, you know, native plants, things that we didn't quantify in this analysis that are probably, you know, helping drive some of these patterns that you're seeing right here. Okay, so let's just look a little bit more about some habitat features and some bird maps. Okay, so this is just looking at general tree canopy cover patterns throughout LA. And the reason why it's going to look broken up like this is because this is, again, every parcel. And so I'm just highlighting, looking at these patterns going from the red, which is very low tree canopy cover, to the darker blue, which is going to be higher tree canopy cover. And this is probably not a surprising map, but you would need to be down in Palos Verdes or need to be in the foothills of the Santa Monica Mountains or up here where you're going to get a lot more tree canopy. I think it's interesting to note that one of the only valley locations on this map where there's high tree canopy cover is around here, around some places in the San Gabriel Valley. So this is interesting. I want to kind of tell a little story about Temple City. So our oldest son was going to daycare there and we would drive up from Monterey Park to get into Temple City, and they have the biggest trees in the area. And so if you look at the sycamore trees and the camphor trees, they're massive. And so I don't know if that's because there's deep soils or what. And so I started thinking that I guess just the San Gabriel Valley was like, if you plant trees here, they're going to grow well, because I know there's a ton of agriculture here and whatever it might have been. But you can kind of see and imagine some of the patterns that you're noticing in South LA, you know, not a lot of tree canopy cover. All right, so looking at land value, same kind of thing in terms of they kind of mirror each other a little bit, except for when you get on the coast. Of course, that's where a lot of the expensive real estate is going to be. And then I don't need to spend too much time on this because I think we're kind of all familiar with kind of like how land value factors out. But what I want to do show is that you can take those two things, tree cover, land value, and you can make some predictive maps about where you're going to expect to find things like forest birds. And so remember, this is about an aggregation of about 15 different species. And we are looking at, it's kind of a combination, but you're going to find a lot more up here. of course, whenever we do our surveys up here, we're finding all these great birds. You know, we're close to the mountains. There's a lot of reasons why you're going to find some really cool stuff here. And then when you start getting down towards kind of where the Cal State LA campus is, or start getting into East LA, South LA, you're not seeing as much. How about urban birds? When you look at this, it's the exact opposite, just like those regression lines I was showing previously. So if you go down to South LA and you do a bird survey, you're actually going to get a very high abundance of birds, but it's going to be a high abundance of house finches and pigeons and starlings and things like this. So the abundance is going to be really high. Diversity is going to be really low in terms of what you're going to find. That's the opposite of what you find up here. You still have starlings, you still have house finches and all that. Their abundances are lower though. And then there's other species of birds that you're going to find. So you get a more diverse bird community in certain locations. All right, so let's see right here. Okay, so I want to share just a little bit about the entirety of LA. If you're looking at our predictive maps right there and what you're going to see in terms of birds and redlining. So this is just based on our predictions and it's a little bit similar, but of course, in those high investment areas, what we're predicting is like anywhere you go where they drew in green lines in the 30s, that's where you're going to find the highest abundance of these forest birds. If you go to San Marino, if you go to Beverly Hills, if you go to any of those places, that's where it's going to be. And of course that is, like we go out there, we count, that's the same thing. And then it goes all the way down to these D locations. What I want to point out is that when you look at the difference, and I'm just drawing the difference between the median line here on these two, you get a median of 94 birds at any location you go count in per 100 meters circle and these green lined areas, and then you get 58. So that's a 39% difference in terms of what you're going to find for these forest birds. The urban bird abundance, it's the opposite pattern. I want to highlight this about what you're actually going to find. Again, way higher abundance, 24% difference between those green lined areas and those red lined areas. I'm going to come back to these numbers. So if we compare parts of LA that weren't part of the process or weren't part of this program at all, and you just look at and you categorize them based on whether they're low income, median income, the lowest 33%, the middle 33%, the highest 33%, you see that you don't get as big a difference between like those low income and high income areas. And so there's something going on there with like those green lined areas and that investment in terms of really like large house sizes, all that in terms of what was attracting birds. Okay, and then when we look at our urban birds, it's not as quite a big a difference between these. And these are locations that, again, were not graded. They're not part of the program. Here, just low income, median income, and high income, just a 29% difference between these locations. So if you're looking at this and you want to kind of quantify this all together and you're saying, what are these redlined areas really that bad? Like, are these the places that are like, should we still be worried about these in terms of our bird community? And I'm just showing you like some effect size stuff. There's much more of this in this paper. If you look at this with the forest bird difference, the urban bird difference, and then you compare it with the non-graded areas, there's definitely a difference here that we're seeing. I want to say definitely, it's not like a massive difference, but noteworthy that the highest abundance of those forest birds, again, are in those green lined areas. And you don't see that in other high income areas in LA. High income areas in LA that were not green lined are hard to come by because most of them were like that. And so almost all the high income areas that you go to right now, they were part of this program, unless you got pretty far in the suburbs, pretty far outside of town. Okay, so there's like 10 other lines of evidence that we have in this paper, but I'm just going to show this one to like kind of bring this point home. But just kind of, I guess you never believe anyone that says believe you, but believe me that when we're getting to this about these red line things, there's a signal there for sure that there's still some indirect downstream effects in terms of what we're seeing with our bird community. I think this is you, right? Okay, I was taking a picture of Dennis Park. I don't know. I was just trying to find a picture of like people birding. Okay, so look, we're going to look at race and ethnicity and urban avifauna in LA because I want to tie together some things here. And so one thing that we work on a lot, and especially with students in my lab, is they're really interested in like, well, okay, like I'm interested in birds. Am I going to be able to have the same kind of birds in the neighborhood that I grew up in as people who live in other parts of LA. And so we started playing around with things like looking at the census data and just overlaying them with our predictive maps to try to come up with this idea about like who really potentially has a chance to experience certain components of the bird community just from their backyard, rather than having to go somewhere. So I'm going to show some maps here and just look at the distribution. So these are just census blocks. These are current census data. So first, I'm just going to show the distribution of the proportion of census blocks where it's Black or African American, and going from just to the east of Culver City down into Carson, a little area up in Altadena, et cetera. When you look at white, it's basically on the coast, or when you start getting up into the Santa Monica Mountains, basically outside of the city. I learned a whole lot going through this that I did not know about the phenomenon of white flight and things where I was doing a lot of reading, which was kind of interesting. I just didn't know about it. And so when I was doing some research on this, so the Asian population, mostly in the San Gabriel Valley, so getting towards the southern San Gabriel Valley, out towards Diamond Bar and down in Palos Verdes, and then Hispanic or Latino, East LA, South LA, and then moving into Eastern San Gabriel Valley, Pomona Valley, and then also up in the San Fernando Valley. So if you take these maps and just overlay them on those predictions, which is what we did, that I was showing you, those maps there, you might start getting a sense of like, well, who gets to really start experiencing everything? But first I want to show you who is currently living when you look at those race and ethnicity maps in the redlined areas. Any guesses? Anyone want to wager a guess? Yeah, so we'll get a look at this. So Black or African American, this is actually who the program was initially intended for in terms of redlining. And so when you look here from the A to B to C, there's actually not a big difference when you start looking at the different groups here. When you start looking at the white population of greater LA, mostly in A, but kind of a big distribution. Note the spread of the points, those little dots, they kind of go all over the place. Asian, kind of flat across those, but then when you get to Hispanic and Latino, look down at the D zone, and so look at the red line zone. And so when you're looking at this and you start saying, okay, like, you know, the distribution of the city in those maps I was just showing, here's how the correlation lines up when you just overlay those historic maps here. And if you want to look at the correlations, oh my gosh, there's my talk, I'm all done. Okay, so here we go. Nobody saw that. They didn't give the punchline away, you know, all that stuff. Okay, so when you just want to look at correlations and you just want to take those data in terms of the proportion of a given race or ethnic group within a census block, and you just correlate it with, say, what I'm going to do here, forest bird abundance, and you start looking. So Black or African American, white, notice the distribution of the points in terms of where these were coming from. And these all relate to those HOLC grades. Asian, and then Hispanic or Latino. And so you start seeing that big difference there. Most students I work with at Cal State are Hispanic or Latino, and whenever they see this, they say, of course I know this. Of course this is what my experience was growing up. Of course this is exactly, you know, what we would say or what you would expect when you're looking at this. I still was pretty blown away, you know, seeing this stuff, not being from Los Angeles and kind of looking at all this. So it's pretty frustrating actually when I talk to my students and say, dang, you know. So when we're looking at this and we're looking at all this stuff, we say, okay, there's very clear patterns, and these are the ones that you want to kind of pick out right here in terms of the differences. So this is kind of where I start coming back to what I was talking about earlier, and it's this idea about, does it matter if, like, and let's just think about like your happiness level. I don't care where I am. When I hear a house finch singing, I get happy. I don't care if I'm in downtown LA or if I'm in my backyard in Monterey Park or if I'm up here. It's a beautiful song. I get really happy when I hear that. I don't care where I am. If I see an Audubon's warbler that's in its alternate plumage, you know, before it's going to migrate, I don't care if I'm in downtown LA or if I'm up here. I get happy when I see that. So there's like a little bit of a happiness index. And so this idea about who potentially gets to see or experience certain types of birds, is that a problem? I don't know. I'm not really sure if that is. And so it's something where like you can see these patterns right here, but what it gets to and what we kind of have come to a conclusion to is it's much more than that. It's where the distribution of parks are. It's the access to green spaces. It's other things that are influencing where the birds are, but also where certain, you know, certain communities don't have access to certain things. So it's a much bigger issue that goes beyond birds, but they can be our barometer for at least telling us that, like, okay, you know, some things need to be improved here. All right, so I just want to talk a little bit about some of the solutions for some of this stuff, and I hope it's clear when I'm talking about this that these patterns are actually pretty clear when looking at this. And I think all of us would say we all love birds. We're all thinking about biodiversity in the city. We want this to be equitable. Just thinking about who gets to experience this stuff everywhere. And so I just want to talk about a couple interesting places. This is basically just our forest bird group, and this is just looking at tree cover. And I already kind of pointed out a few of these areas. There's some locations in LA that were redlined that are now some of the expensive places in the whole city. Venice and Santa Monica are good locations for that. You guys are probably familiar with oil drilling that was very common in Venice and also in certain parts of Santa Monica. That's why those areas were redlined back in the day. Of course, lots of things have changed over time, and so they're now some of the most expensive places to live. So with Venice, you see that it was redlined, but now you can still, of course, go there, and there's tons of birds there. And it's actually one of the birdiest places in LA where we do our surveys. And I don't know if it's just a certain street that we're on, but every time we go over there, there's just tons and tons and tons of birds in that location. Northwest Pasadena is another example, a place that was redlined, and you start looking at it now, and there's probably people in the audience here that are much more knowledgeable about the history of Pasadena, but there was already a well-established tree community. Pasadena's always been obsessed with its trees. Like when I go back to records and looking at people living here in the late 1800s, they were always writing about the trees and how it was a big part of the culture of the city and the area. And so the establishment of that culture has played over, even if there was some places that were redlined and experienced some of this stuff that was going on that potentially were developed a lot differently than other parts of LA that maybe didn't quite have that culture of like loving trees or being obsessed about trees. I love that about Pasadena, by the way. It's one of my favorite places just to go for a walk because of all the street trees and everything. And Lois and I have talked about these things in the past and kind of shared like how interesting it is to have that history here. So are these solutions? They're not really solutions, but they're meant to say that there are ways to, through investment, I'm going to talk about this a little bit, to potentially kind of start creeping out of this. But I'm telling you, when you start looking and reading about a lot of the things that have gone on in some of these locations, it's a very steep uphill climb. And so not just thinking about the people, but just thinking about the birds, the development in those areas, it's going to take a while to get out of this. A lot of people are thinking about it though. All right, so what are some of the things that we can potentially think about in terms of redlining and urban biodiversity in LA? So the whole program, or at least that last part of what the HLC was doing, I was talking about identifying prime areas for real estate and investment. Investment's key, but there's a catch with this. So you can go into a community and invest and start pumping money into it, but then what could potentially happen can lead to like, hey, this place is changing a lot, and it could start increasing home values and start doing things like maybe potentially pushing some people out. You guys heard of gentrification and everything. The example that we write about in the paper is the High Line in New York City. Has anybody been to the High Line? It's one of my favorite places to go in New York. It's so cool. It's such an interesting place. When I learned more about the history, it was derelict infrastructure in that location. They came up with this amazing plan to build, a walkway elevated above the city, and all the property values went through the roof there because it was such an interesting place, and people had to bail and people had to leave. So investment like that can be amazing. That's like one of, I think, the major attractions of the many attractions in New York, but it comes at a cost. And so there's a lot of people thinking about investment at a much smaller scale, pocket parks, other things that are green within communities that potentially, might not reach that level for something like the High Line in terms of driving up property values. Another thing that's really important is, of course, community buy-in for a lot of, whatever the projects are going to be. And I think actually in LA, my experience is there's pretty good communication between various groups doing development, community buy-in, et cetera. I don't know as much about it, but that's my kind of my sense. Okay, so the other thing, I was talking about cultural preferences. There's definitely cultural preferences. And the thing I like to highlight, because it's a personal one for me, my wife is Chinese American. Her parents are from Shanghai and Taiwan, moved to LA. And we thankfully inherited the house that they had purchased out in Monterey Park. And when we inherited it, the landscaping was just rocks, a Japanese pine, and a couple fruit trees. That's all they wanted. in there. And when I moved there, I thought there's no grass, there's no trees or there's no shrubs or something. And that was what my wife wanted too. So we converted the whole thing and put a bunch of native plants in and all that. And it took a lot of time, but it was just a difference about, of course, what her parents wanted and then what we, kind of what we thought about. I think about that often in LA with a big diverse city like this, because a lot of the decisions that we make just at our home, whether it's in the front yard or the backyard, certainly filter up to influence everything, the insects, the birds that you're going to see. So some things like understanding, and when you're looking at those maps I was showing, it's kind of segregated, when you're looking around the city. So whether there's potentially cultural preferences for some of this stuff, I don't know. It's interesting. It's something I want to kind of dive into as we keep moving forward. Okay, so birds and biodiversity are definitely resilient. We've seen that in a lot of different contexts, conservation contexts throughout the world. But a conservation is the goal. We have to incorporate these habitat features. The simplest one is tree cover. We know that. The city of LA is very aggressive actually in planting trees and identifying places where they have to plant trees. But so many of the trees die when they plant them in a lot of locations, and especially in low income communities. There might be renters, there might be things where it's like, because the street tree, you guys, homeowners know this, you have the tree in front of your house, that's public property, but you got to keep it alive. You got to go out there and water it and do all that stuff and make sure it's doing its thing. And a lot of people are like, I don't want to do that, or I don't want the tree going in my water line, or I don't want whatever it might be. I don't need jacaranda flowers all over my car or whatever it is. And so people have a lot of feelings about this. And so they're aggressively trying, the city to do this, but it's a difficult, I don't want to say difficult. It's a challenging thing because everyone has their own preferences for how they want to do this. Okay. I was going to say that communities can rebound, but this really hasn't happened across much of LA. We're seeing this, and I don't want to pick on LA because it's basically every city where this has gone on. This is New York, Chicago, wherever. If you were focused on a lot of if you just look at the news and what, if there's stories about problems in a city, often it's in locations that were experiencing this stuff. So it's these, like I said earlier, it's these downstream effects, these small ripples that come out of it, they just get larger and larger and larger. And, there needs to be a lot of investment there to work on it. I wish I was more of like an urban planner or knew more about it. We're just focused on the patterns on the biodiversity side, but I find it fascinating. Okay, I'm going to roughly shift gears because we're going to come back and talk about this stuff, but just to wake everybody up. Who is this? Which bird is this? It could be in our urban group, but it's like a really cool urban group if you're going to find it. So this is, yeah, it's a mockingbird, but it's a Galapagos mockingbird. And so, you might find this hanging out somewhere else. I just had to throw a picture and something cool. We're doing an Audubon talk right now. So what I want to do is I want to shift some gears because I'm looking at the time. I'm trying to wind up by 8:30 or so. And I just want to talk about a few different projects that we're working on in my lab. And I'll come back to some questions about the redlining stuff when we're all done. Okay, so first I'm going to talk about native plants in residential yards in LA and birds. I'm going to talk about some historical bird modeling that we're doing, what was here and what's been lost. And I'm going to end by talking about this new project that we have about food webs of LA. So this is a paper that's going to come out this week, I hope. And so some of you may know Noriko, maybe have met her. Some of you might have been a part of this project. So looking at the ecological role of native plant landscaping in residential yards to birds. And check this out. Yeah, right there, so thank you very much. We didn't try to time this with when you guys are making decisions about funding, for the lab. So anyway, so there's been a lot of research on landscaping your yard with native plants. Lois was just talking about this. I think we all have, drank that Kool-Aid a long time ago. We know that's a good thing to be doing. But a lot of the academic research has been focused on the East Coast and the UK and Australia. That's where much of it has come out of, and it's been focused on breeding birds. That's really been kind of the thing. And so I'm tied in with a lot of those folks on the East Coast, the Talamay group, Desiree Narango, the people that have been doing these things. And so I said, hey, you guys did that there. I want to do it here. We want to do the same kind of things you guys have been doing there, but we're going to apply our twist to it and think about the wintering birds. I didn't say this earlier, why we survey during the winter, but the winter is really where we are strong in terms of our bird community and coming down. You guys maybe have seen this paper that came out 2 years ago called Keep Common Birds Common. It's a very famous paper in science. It's basically saying that all of our birds are declining, and especially our common birds are declining big time. And so in Los Angeles, we have a lot of birds that we think are common, like yellow-rumped warblers that will come down here and spend the winter, and then they migrate up wherever they're going to go breed further north. And we have millions of these birds that come down, not just that species, of course, but just migratory birds that come down and spend the winter here. And that's where we can like really make a difference in their populations, is by having crucial habitat for them to do their thing, do whatever they need to do. Then they can migrate north and hopefully breed. And if you're in BC or British Columbia where those birds are breeding, then you have your native yard, and then you do your thing during the summertime, and then they can kind of come back here. So that's really what we were looking at. It was during the winter time. And a couple things like, you know, there's our house right here, just some of our native plants, and just down the street, a lot of this stuff, you know, going on all over LA. If you look at the vast majority, there's been a team from UCLA that's done this. If you look at the vast majority of yards in LA, it's something like 97% fall into the kind of this category of like grass, hedge. You know, you might have rocks or some other kind of structures, but it's not like our native plants. There's a lot of the xeriscaping stuff, which, you know, are like cactus and all that. It's better just to go ahead and like throw down some coastal sage scrub or chaparral, maybe a couple oaks or whatever in your yard, and you're going to get some stuff. So if you're just comparing the two here, of course, there's going to be way more birds and insects and all that stuff than over here. But what's interesting about all this stuff is when you focus in on the ecology of birds feeding on these plants. And so you actually watch them and what they're going to be doing. Are they going to be going to an exotic plant to find some food? Are they going to be going to a native plant? And when you just compare native plants versus some of our non-native plants, you guys can see some of them over here. You definitely see a higher proportion of bird feeding in native plants than in our non-native plants in these yards. Not a big surprise there, but it's still kind of cool. And then when you do some correlations with this and you just look at plant cover for oaks, heteromyles, we're going to be thinking about some toyon, and thinking about Arctostaphylos, manzanita, eriogonum, salvia, our sage plants. These are going to be really, yeah, did I get it wrong? Yep. This feels like a really good robin year to me. So where we go hiking out in the Puente Hills, there's so many robins out there. Yeah, that's exactly what they've been feeding on out there as well. So it feels like a good robin year to me. They're a little bit like, that's kind of a cool species, because I don't want to say they're nomadic, but they do move around a little bit. And so if you have a year where there's tons of fruits, like on these toyons, they're going to come down and gobble them up. But that's one of the big ones that if you put that in your yard, you're going to get birds coming in and using that stuff. So native plants, I think we're all on board with that, but that's what kind of the crux here. So historical birds, I want to highlight Sean's the grad student working on this in the back. So we're trying to understand the past distributions of birds throughout greater LA and effectively see what we have lost. And I put this loggerhead shrike here because when we go into this database, we have a database of nests and eggs throughout all of LA, mainly collected in the late 1800s, getting into the early 1900s. And when you start looking at the database for like what used to be here, it kind of blows your mind. Lots of loggerhead shrikes, you know, breeding around there, lots of tricolored blackbirds, lots of birds that we think of are like, you know, we'll like travel to go look at. And they, of course, used to be around in these areas. So what Sean has been working so hard on, and we're a team of researchers from different institutions, USC, UCLA, is that we want to know what the landscape used to look like. I'm just going to show you kind of a snippet, and then we're modeling what those birds used to use, and then we're going to compare it with our more modern breeding bird atlas data, where we actually have teams of people go out and know exactly if there's stuff breeding. So this is a map of the potential natural vegetation of the Los Angeles area. So this is like what we think hypothetically the area look like. And in each of these grids, you can say, this is grassland, this is coastal sage scrub. It would be like 50% or more of what we think the land cover would be one of these land cover types. And we're revising this big time. But anyway, if you're looking at this, there's mostly grassland in the San Fernando Valley. The San Gabriel Valley was probably grassland, coastal sage scrub, savanna. There's probably a lot of different stuff going on throughout the San Gabriel Valley. Lots of grassland down in the dunes when you started getting down into the South Bay. Woodlands, of course, in our foothill areas, and then wetlands distributed throughout along the major riverways. Importantly, I just saw a cool photo today from a friend who works at UC Merced. All the vernal pools up there are going nuts with all of this rain. And so this is going to be a huge year for fairy shrimp and tiger salamanders and all that stuff. Loads of vernal pools around here too. There used to be lots of them, and we don't hardly have any of that stuff anymore because it's all been paved over. So if you just want to look at the predicted occurrence or occupancy of grassland birds, we did some work where we said, hey, let's take the 12 most common grassland birds, loggerhead shrike, Swainson's hawk, killdeer, stuff that we had in our database that had bred in the area, and then try to model their historic occupancy. Where we were going to see them is going to be in the San Fernando Valley, the San Gabriel Valley, and certain parts of the San Gabriel Valley, and then of course getting down into South LA. And then you kind of contrast that. Of course, if you're using this map to make your prediction, that's where you're going to find things, but that's exactly what we were, kind of working on. The other group of birds, the woodland birds, we're hypothesizing they don't change as much because there's still like kind of oaks and all that stuff in some of the foothill communities. But the other birds that we're predicted, the grassland birds, to just have a massive decline, and the other one are going to be our marshland birds. And so we're looking at marshland birds. We did some modeling where we took about 15 species and looked at all of their occurrence around the area. So this is a mixture of birds like tricolored blackbird, but also cinnamon teal, black-necked stilt, other things that you might see at some of our, you can go to like, Peck Lake or Peck Road and see some of these birds, but a lot of those birds used to be much more common, of course, around the area. So where would we see those? Well, this is San Gabriel River, going along the course of the LA River, Biono wetlands. Again, there used to be spillover because there used to be proper floodplains from all these rivers. And so when it would flood, you would get you'd get inundation and scouring, you would get marshlands filling up, freshwater marsh filling up, and we just don't get that anymore. So anyway, wetlands like grasslands have been hammered, and so that's a big part of the bird community that we've likely lost. Okay, so what else are we doing? Our next steps, lots of projects. We're looking at breeding bird density and restored coastal sage scrub habitats, black mustard, the cultural and biological importance of black walnut, mammal occupancy in relation to weather extremes. And then the last one I want to talk about is just our food web analysis. So we just got an NSF project, a National Science Foundation project, funded to potentially make the biggest urban food web experiment out there. And so what we're going to do, and this is based on our street tree work. And so we notice these patterns and this isn't news, but we're going to dial into this stuff. Of course, our native trees around the area, that's where our birds like to feed. Our non-native trees, some of them are pretty darn good, actually. Some of the non-native trees our birds really like, but a lot of them they just completely avoid. And so there's all sorts of like theories about, well, they've adapted or evolved to eat certain insects that are on certain trees or whatever it might be. But we have really scant evidence of like how that actually plays. And we're going to figure it out. So we're going to be planting over 200 trees, mostly not native and non-native oaks throughout Los Angeles. And we're going to do various experiments over time. This is like a 10-year experiment that we're going to be doing, where we're going to be quantifying the insect community, quantifying acorn production, quantifying when the birds are using different trees. We have all these sorts of hypotheses about, whether trees are native to the area or non-native to the area, how that's going to influence everything. And I'm really excited about it. And so maybe I can give multiple talks about this over the years, and who knows what we'll see, but that's like one of the big things that we're just starting this semester. All right, so that's basically it and for the talk. So I'll take questions or anything you guys might have about the redlining stuff or anything, or just we can chat. Yeah. I'll try to repeat it if
I talked about redlining. I think based on what I saw, it was a stronger trend of fewer forest birds and black bear. That price wasn't strong.
Right. It's actually interesting. I didn't show another graph where you look at it's a box plot graph, and it's actually the Black and African American community is actually the lowest on that graph, and it just doesn't come out in those correlations when you look at that. And so if I were to show that, the way it would go would be it would be white, Asian, Hispanic, and Latino. The Hispanic and Latino data are interesting because there's a very wide spread in terms of who's experiencing what. Some very wealthy Hispanic and Latino communities, some very poor Hispanic and Latino communities. So you see that trend. For the Black or African American community, it's mostly on the poor end. And so that's where it kind of drags down those predictions. And so it's actually the least amount you see there. It just didn't show up in those correlations, but that's a great question. Did I repeat the question or did I just answer it? I don't even know if I repeated it. I'll try to repeat it for the people online. Yeah.
I would put right.
curious about, so the redlining practices that went from the 30s to 60s. It strikes me, and I'm no urban expert, but it seems to me that low income housing in the 30s, what smaller lots than say low income housing in the 60s, like the disparity between a rich house in the 30s and a small house in the 30s, the amount of land they use seems much greater. And I'm wondering if you see any changes in like communities that built, say, in like 50s and 60s or the 80s. Are the differences not as clear?
I think that's where like some of those patterns, I think when you get off into the suburbs a little bit and you have larger parcels, I think it all comes down to the amount of green that you have, whether it's shrubs, trees, et cetera. So if it's packed in there and you just don't have that, it's not going to work. And one of the things we find consistently with our research, whether it's a park, whether it's looking at building density, whatever, it's this phenomenon that you see in the ecological world all over that you definitely see in cities too. It's called the species area effect. And it's basically just the more habitat you have, the more species you're going to have. And we see that all over the place in urban areas. And so if that is true, if that is the case, that it's going to be denser in those low-income communities in the 30s versus those in like say the 50s and 60s, you're going to find more stuff and more birds in those areas in the 50s and 60s, just because of more available habitat. Note though, one thing that's Travis Longcore has been doing some really interesting work about this, and they've been mapping basically the densification of the suburbs all throughout LA for the past 20 years or so. So the idea of building extra structures on your property, building mega mansions, and just building the entire thing, and anything like that, it doesn't matter how wealthy that house is, that's going to be just as bad, so that's another phenomenon that's been going on, not just in LA, but in a lot of cities. And it's just the densification process. So I just was in Tokyo, and that's, because it's of course such an old city. I know it was hammered during World War II bombing, but when they built it back, from what I understood, they built in a lot of the same places. And so it's still just so dense. And that's just hundreds and thousands of years of just building this city together. And I don't know if LA is ever going to get to that point because of the whole suburban dream, that, the sprawl that the city was based on. But we are starting to see that a little bit in certain places, especially in San Gabriel Valley. Yeah, question. Well, a lot of people, I don't know if they're going to love this one, but so what non-native trees do the forest birds love? And Chinese elm is one of the big ones. And so one of the ones, I think Chinese elm are really pretty. And so, but there's a thing. So I've done quite a bit of research in different countries and different places. There's a handful of trees that it doesn't matter where they are good for wildlife. Eucalyptus is one. I don't want to say good, but you find a lot of things. And so I know a lot of people think about this. So eucalyptus, oak is king in the Northern Hemisphere, wherever you find it. Doesn't matter if you're in China, wherever, you're going to find a lot of birds there. Elm is another one. And so we used to have American elms all over the country. Of course, those have been wiped out by Dutch elm disease. Those were fantastic trees for our feeding birds. They're in the same genus Ulmus as Chinese elm. And it's weird to me that Chinese elm is such an important tree here during the wintertime for birds. This is before they drop all their leaves. But that's one of the big ones that they like. Magnolia, not at all. That's the worst during the winter. Yeah. Comparing the Chinese elm to say coast live oak is king around here. And so there's no better tree for our birds during the wintertime. There's insects all over it, the acorns, et cetera. So that's the best one. If you had an equally sized tree on the same street, you would still find a lot of birds in both places, but you would find more in a coast live oak. And the thing with coast live oak that's different in the wintertime is, I was mentioning this, the Chinese elm is winter deciduous. So it's eventually going to drop its leaves. And that's where a lot of if there's insects or whatever, that the birds are coming down in October and November, when a lot of our winter migrants come down, that's what they're going to take advantage of. So when they lose their leaves, it's kind of that sort of zips it for them. Whereas coast live oak, evergreen, that's going to be good all year round. And that's kind of interesting. So it's interesting being on the coastal slope here where it doesn't really freeze. That's why we still have a lot of these birds coming here because there's insects active during the wintertime. There's much more active during the summertime, but we still have quite a bit that are active during the wintertime. So that's really good question, thinking about those different trees. Yeah. We planted, this is not a coast live oak, so we planted a 15-gallon Engelmann oak in our yard. And interestingly, we planted one in the street well, and it just won't grow as big because it's covered with, pavement and stuff like that. But then we planted one in our yard. It's a big tree, and it's 5 years old right now, and it's covered with birds at any time of the year. So I think it depends. Whereas the one in the street's not doing as well. So I guess it just depends on like the growing conditions and how well it takes off. But it needs to be sufficiently big, I think. We'll tell you with this experiment because we're going to plant a bunch of these trees, and yeah, we'll see how that's going to go. Yeah.
Sticking with trees.
We're really interested in black walnut, and that's a tree that I kind of mentioned it there. There's a student, Natasha, actually, who's really interested in this, and we want to try to just like first off quantify what they mean towards our birds. We know in the wintertime they're going to be good for woodpeckers. There's certain species, a lot of beetles that hang out there that like a Nuttall's woodpecker will just love to get. Summertime, we have less data on what's going to be there, but we know that they were going to be really important, culturally super important tree for indigenous peoples in the area. And we're going to try to unravel that. We don't have great knowledge of where all the stands are. There's some good ones in the Puente Hills. There's Debs Park, you got to get on those north facing slopes where it's pretty wet soils. They're a tree that people are really worried about in terms of climate change. If it gets any drier and drought, they're one that is going to get pretty hammered. Coast live oak, nice tap roots, they're a little bit more resilient. I mean, all of our trees are going to be in trouble if we keep like this year, a lot of water, but last couple of years, I don't know how many times it rained last year, but not many. And anytime that's going to happen, it's going to be a problem. So if so John, one thing I will mention about this, there was a professor who used to be at Oxy, John Keeley. He's a researcher with the USGS right now. He's really kind of famous forest ecologist, and he was doing a lot. They mapped all the black walnut everywhere, and I'm trying to get my hands on those data. So if anyone knows John, let me know.
Early in the talk, we had a slide from previous occasions that showed redlining on the city's product. But I think they didn't say when the redlining happened.
That's true. Yeah.
Because there's been massive changes in some of the cities. For example, one of the cities in that block,
yeah,
the area around where we were born at the time was very wet. And it was full of stately old homes with loads of trees back in the late 60s. And now it's an area where I was beginning to
yeah.
So it's really kind of curious for those cities that went back. It was that redlining in the 30s or was in the 50s or the 60s.
So great question. So for those online, this is focused on okay, it's okay. I don't need to go back to it. Focused on the plot I was talking about with tree cover from Dexter Locke's paper in 2021 from numerous cities based on redlining and what year that was happening. And they don't talk about it in that paper, actually. The big critique with that paper is they don't compare to areas that were not part of the process. They just overlaid, and there's lots of parts of cities that weren't part of that process. But the year thing is a really good question. From my understanding, most of this was applied in the 30s. And I don't think I talked about this, and I said I was going to mention this, and so maybe I'll just bring this up right now. There's a debate among historians, and the only reason why I'm comfortable saying this is because one of my colleagues on this paper is a historian down at USC who explained this to me. There's a debate in the historian academic community about whether these redlining maps were intended for secret use or they intended just to blast out to all the banks and then they can make their decisions about what they wanted to do. And it seems that that was different in different cities and applied in different years. And so that might be hard data to come to, but I think it's something that's really interesting to think about. I feel like those cities too, in particular, the Rust Belt cities, because there has been so many big changes. I'm thinking Detroit, I don't know Cleveland as well. land abandonment, people moving, just wholesale changes to neighborhoods, like you were saying, houses being torn down. I feel like all of that stuff, they don't talk about it in that paper. And I feel like all that stuff would be ripe for like studying interesting effects, you know, in terms of how that influences birds and whatever. So I don't know if I'm answering your question. They don't talk about that in that paper though, but I think it's an interesting thing to think about. Here and then, yeah, in the back.
Strawberry tree, we have like 70 campus out there, you know, and getting some like
Mhm. What's the genus of it? I'm curious. Okay. Yeah, I think we haven't come across a lot of those. We had a few of them in our residential yard study, actually, and I don't recall those standing out so much, but there's lots of trees that do, and in places where like we have our data. Well, like a good example is we have a pomegranate tree in our backyard and birds seem to really love it. And we didn't have pomegranate in any of our studies. There's plenty of plants that are out there that I would just encourage you guys to just say like, yeah, they seem to be pretty good for birds. There's some resource there that they're digging on. And that changes throughout the year too. It's important to note, we were talking about this earlier, the phenology of the trees, the timing of when they flower, the timing of when they have their fruits, the timing of whatever that might be is really interesting because that's going to attract different birds at different times of the year. And so there might be some things that are really great during the spring or really great during the fall. Like coast live oak is really great throughout the entire year. So there's some species like that. That's why I always say that coast live oak is king. But that's a really important thing to think about if there's some seasonal resource like a toyon, you know, right now that's just going to be like so valuable for our wintering birds. Next question.
I can draw you a map of where local platform is. You can get to.
Okay. Yeah, if there's a stand, that would be wonderful because yeah, that's like what we've kind of been looking for. A lot of the stands we come across are small, you know, they're small trees that don't look like they're doing. I think I might like how far up, like in terms of the
Beginning of Lower Brown Mountain.
okay. Yeah, that'd be great. That'd be really kind of cool. Oh, the experiment's definitely justified because we're looking at different diversity of trees. There's a whole history on this in terms of the diversity of trees that urban forestry wants in a city. And that's lined up. We kind of talked about this 10-20-30 rule, which is what a lot of urban foresters go through. So 10% of the tree canopy can be of a certain family, 20% of a certain genus, 10% of a certain species, 20% of a certain genus, 30% of a certain family. And most cities will not go outside of that. And the reason why is because of Dutch elm disease. It's because they used to line the streets with just nothing but elm trees on the East Coast and wiped them all out. And so just one pathogen came in and they said, we can't do this. We have to have a resilient forest. So that's a big part of it. And so trying to just have trees that they know are going to grow well here. They know are going to grow well when they put them in a tree well. Often when you look at a lot of the trees that they have planted on sidewalks, especially when it's a small tree well, it's a swamp tree, like a liquid ambar or something that can just withstand having wet soil, you know, throughout the year. And so they're not going to get a lot of fungus. And so when you talk to a lot of the urban foresters, they can tell you exactly what is not going to die in certain places. And then they just go down and look at their list and say, okay, if we're going to invest in a tree right here, we want some of that course is going to live. And then we can't push past the diversity quota. With Pasadena right now, they're kind of at their quota for oaks. And so they're like sort of coming up with like, hey, we don't feel too comfortable if we plant too many oaks. And this isn't coming from me. This is, you know, sort of where the planting thing is at. And I think they're worried about if something like the gold spotted oak borer, which is in the hills all around here, comes down into LA, it could just devastate our oak trees. And so it's the same thing, the same scenario with Dutch elm disease, but other trees as well. Another thing about what you see on the streets is a lot of this is related to affluence. And so one of the big things with Los Angeles is, right, we diverted water. We said we can plant whatever we want and look at how great of a city we were. And so that's what a lot of it was too, was historical, going back to the 1920s, et cetera, when a lot of communities were being developed. So it's kind of a mixture of some of those forces. People are trying to shift that right now, but the big problem with Los Angeles is we just don't have a lot of big canopy trees that are native to the area that you can start planting all over. And so if you have coast live oak, California sycamore, I don't know, like where like there's lots of trees like toyon and stuff that maybe can grow into tree size, but if you're going to plant it as a canopy tree on a sidewalk, we don't have a lot of options. And so again, they kind of run up to that diversity rule that I was just talking about, which is problematic for them. Yeah. Exactly. Yep. Yeah, and those swamp trees. Yeah, exactly. It's like they know they're going to invest in it. They just want it to do its thing and be okay. And it's really interesting actually going out with a forestry crew, because like, they're looking at things from that point of view. And you can kind of suggest to them that like, well, hey, the birds really like this, and they're kind of like, yeah, we don't care. We want something here that is going to fulfill its role. We need shade or whatever it might be, and that's what they end up putting on the ground. It's different too, depending on who your urban forester is. Pasadena is pretty progressive with that. Santa Monica is too. And actually the city of LA is pretty progressive with that. And then there's a lot of the municipalities around the area that are not at all. And they're pretty hard to work with actually. So we kind of pick and choose with who we work with.
So about bird diversity and all non-native birds in the area.
Yeah. They're pretty good. I wouldn't say they're like up there near like the top of the list for what we have, but in any one of those trees, you can find things like roosting owls, and there's like interesting things that you can find in those trees, from like warblers picking through stuff, maybe not as good as some of the, the angiosperms that you're going to find throughout the area, but I don't know. I think they're pretty good. Canary Island pine, we actually kicked out of our study because it's so difficult to watch a feeding bird in there because it's so dense. Because we would come across them and we'd hear a ton of stuff up there, and then we'd just be staring with our binoculars and you can't see a thing up there because they're just so dense. Aleppo pine's different. Italian stone pine, those are easier to watch some stuff, but they're a little bit lower down on the list. If you guys are interested in that, like the paper that we have published there, I can share, like Lois knows which one it is. We like list out all the trees and which ones are quote good and not. And for Noriko's paper, we do that too, which is a totally different flavor because it has shrubs, which we do not have at all in the street tree stuff. And so that's like what we're trying to do, is just provide this data with saying like people can look at it and say, oh, that like manzanita looks like it's going to be really good, or a certain type of manzanita. And that's one we try to highlight that, could be good for certain birds. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And maybe Noriko's would be a good one too. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, totally.
Just one final question about the food web study or something. That seems like that's not going to be a quick study. What's the timeline?
10 years is my goal right now. And so our goal this year is to get the trees in the ground. And then it's going to be a lot of work because we're doing it right now. And then of course we can't plant during the summer. And so we'll hopefully by Christmas next year, we're going to have all of them in the ground. We have to put the experiment up. There's a bunch of different structures we have to build next year. And then it's just going to see what happens with the whole thing. So it's, yeah, I'm like quote mid-career or whatever. So this is kind of like my mid-career project.
You'd love to have you back.
Oh yeah. That's right. It could be the next decade. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I'm looking to see who's on there.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
What?